Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's fun when you get into topics like this. This week we are in Biblical Principles of Sex, and how does a pastor talk about sex? Where do you begin? Where do we begin? Where do I begin? Where do we go? What do we include? What do we leave out? How do we teach our children? What we'll do is we'll begin where God began, but we're going to spend several minutes here just thinking through, trying to get our bearings, thinking through just how we're going to approach this topic. But we'll begin actually in Genesis 1 in a few minutes, where God began, describing how he created humans to work. There are words in the English language that are used in actually wrong ways, or ways that are more confusing than they are clarifying. One of those words is the word church, and we're working our way through that this year. What is church? Is church the building on the corner? What is a church? But another one of those is the word sex. And our world has turned this so upside down. We're going to be studying 6 principles, and we're going to open the Word of God, and we're going to lay out the foundational principles for how to live our lives in these ways. They're basic. You can teach them to your children at the appropriate age, and they will watch you. They will be watching the way that you live as a couple, and the way. Say we've watched Kristen say as a single, and how she lives her life, and she can teach these principles as well. It's interesting when you think about principles, these foundational truths, when you understand the foundational truths and then you apply them to your life, the actual function of sex becomes less of a problem. And those of you who are married understand this. When you're having problems in your sexual lives, there's usually something else wrong. Something else is going wrong in your marriage. So we're not applying the biblical principles well. In our world, we live in several different ways to say it, but a world in which expressive individualism is huge. Just think about the 2 words, expressive. I need to express myself. Then individualism. I'm my own little world. I'm the center of my universe. Since I'm the center of my universe and I'm going to express myself, where do other people come in that? Other people come into that picture only as I can use them to accomplish what I want to accomplish. And it's a very selfish way of looking at the world. And when you think about our world today of pornography on the internet that is just so rampant, it's everywhere. What is that all about? It's about people doing what they want to do for their own selfish purposes. But then when you think about gender changes and how and who I should be involved with sex with, probably the next thing coming in that is going to be talked about and to become a big issue is child sex. Hey, they love such and so who are we to tell them that they can't express their love? And then bestiality after that. There's no end when it comes to selfishness and how far that goes. This is crucial stuff for us to learn, and if there's any center to our thoughts, God is the center, and we live unselfishly following his principles, giving to others. Many believers attempt to rescue this whole thought of sex in marriage, and sometimes we've been derailed as well in that thought. Some, and I'm doing it on the one hand, on the other hand type of thing. On the one hand, some have said that the sexual experience is the defining element of marriage. This is what defines your marriage. Do you have good sex? Okay, great, you have a good marriage. Do you not have good sex? Okay, you have a bad marriage. This is the pinnacle, the mountaintop of marriage. And that can't be true because of the other things about Scripture. All sorts of books. This has been helpful. This is old, intended for pleasure. This was around before Betsy and I got married. There are other just basic marriage books, Sacred Marriage, What Did You Expect? One that I get a laugh out of every time I read it. How to Be Happy Though Married. Boy, that's really hopeful, isn't it? You know? Oh, I'm sorry for you, you got married. But you can be happy anyway. But the same author, Tim LaHaye, called it the act of marriage. True to the extent that that is where God designed it to be practiced, the practice of sex in marriage. But that's not the only act of marriage. He calls it the act of marriage. There's a lot more involved in marriage. A lot of other books that you could go to, but sometimes we derail the train, so to speak, because we're expecting the wrong things. We're expecting the wrong things in our marriage and in our sex life. One Christian author said, God created this one flesh experience to be the most intense height of physical intimacy, the most profound depth of spiritual oneness between husband and wife. The most. When you say most, that means the mountaintop, the pinnacle. Is it? Is it not? It is certainly an expression of everything else that we are. If you as a couple are one before God and unified before God, and God is the most important person in your marriage, you will most likely be able to have a satisfying sex life. The problem comes when you define, again, the marriage strictly or primarily through sex. But then the opposite extreme, just ignore it altogether. No, we're going to read the Bible together, we're going to go to church together, we're going to have all these other things we do together, and then we just ignore the sex life. And that isn't following God's principles either. So think something like this. Well, sex is so misused by our world today that it has to be bad. Things like good girls don't do that. That thought. No, bad. And if the kids grow up thinking, Mom and Dad think this is a bad thing, they're twisted in their thought processes. Where if they watch Mom and Dad treat each other with respect and kindness and love and even the pat on the bottom or whatever, and Mom, Dad, and just showing them that this is a normal thing within marriage, without being, vulgar or anything like that, but just showing that you care for each other and that your bodies are a joy to each other. That can be a very positive thing. Some, again, attempt to ignore the issue. Some make it the whole center of the whole issue. Your notes talk about that it's very possible to get into sex outside of marriage, even for believers. And they see the Bible promising victory in Jesus, and how Jesus can help us to live for him, and then they try, and they still fail, and they think, oh boy, the Bible must not have answers to my problems. Sometimes it rips the hope out from underneath us, and we've missed the Bible principles. sometimes in those situations, so one person in the marriage goes outside of marriage, the other person, not always, but often, has some sin in their life too. There's always something for us to grow in. Again, we're not assigning blame at this point. We're just saying often there's sin involved in the way that this couple is functioning with each other. That's why we started with these other 5 topics of solving problems, communicating with each other, understanding that God designed this, not us. It's about how God made us to function, not about how we want to function. Where we're going to start out is that this sexual relationship between husband and wife is God's idea. It's a good idea. And that's our Roman numeral number 1. Sex in marriage is pure and holy. It's pure and holy because, letter A, God created sex before sin came into the world. So here's where we are in Genesis chapter 1. This is the 6th day of creation. Sun, moon, and stars have been created. The plants, the swimming, the fish, the birds. And now on day 6, God created human beings. And he made them male and female, we're told, in Genesis chapter 1. And then we come to Genesis 1, verse 31, and God said, all that he had made, he saw it, and behold, it was very good. It's interesting as you read chapter 1 of Genesis that all the other times, so he made the fish in the sea, and he said it was good. He made the birds, and he said it was good. He made the flowers and the trees, and he said it was good. And then he made humans, male and female, and he said it was very good. So God created man and woman and sexual relationships before sin came into the world. Just a note along the side there, I put that sex in marriage was not designed as an outlet for passions of sinful man. And, as I think back, as we think back about before we were married, the week before Betsy and I were to be married a long, long time ago, Betsy was here in Maine, I was in New York, and the pastor I was working with, I was apprentice under, we were out cutting wood one day, and he said, wouldn't you love for the Lord to come back this week? And I thought, not really, but that honestly was my sinful selfishness, thinking of me and what I wanted, my passions, more than I wanted to be with my Savior. But it was a good lesson for me to think through. It was very helpful for me, for him to bring it up in that way. But so marriage was not designed, just think about this. Here's Adam. He's the only human on earth. God creates Eve. There's just the two of them. He created sex, not for Adam's sinful passions outside of that. So that's helpful for us to begin here. Sex in marriage is pure and holy. God created it before sin happened. Letter B, God's view of sex did not change after the fall. Sex is still good and holy within marriage. For that, we go to the New Testament, Hebrews 13, verse 4. This says, let marriage be held in honor among all. Let the marriage bed be undefiled. The marriage bed is holy. The only place where sex is pure and holy is the marriage bed. Interesting, this is the word we get coitus from. That's the Greek word, the marriage bed. This is where it happens. He designed sex so that there's these delights that are experienced in marriage. Those who have had sex outside of marriage, it was delightful maybe, but not as much as within marriage, within God's plan. Letter C, sexual relations in marriage are just as holy as any other spiritual activity. Sometimes we think, oh no, we don't have time for that. We have to read our Bible instead. Well, yeah, let's read our Bible together. That's holy. Let's go to church together and serve together in church in whatever way we're serving. Yeah, that's holy. Later this week, Betsy and I are going to Kittery to the conference down there. Betsy will be teaching kids in a junior church type of program, and I'll be leading singing. Yeah, that's holy. Well, let's go play in the bedroom. Well, that's holy. You know, the sex in marriage is just as holy, or can be, as any other spiritual activity. No, again, qualifying that, sex in marriage according to God's principles. If I'm going into sex in marriage in a very selfish way, in an abusive way, just using Betsy for my pleasure as opposed to seeking hers, then that would be an unholy way of doing it. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. Letter D, one cannot violate God's principles of sex and avoid the consequences. 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 6 says, let no man transgress and defraud his brother in this matter, because the Lord is the avenger in all these things. When we defraud others relating to the sexual relationship, the Lord avenges it. There is problems that we will experience. I'm not going to go into that a lot right now, but everything from your prayer life being hindered to physical problems, to health issues, sexually transmitted diseases, but God's judgment. The Lord is the avenger of this. 1 Thessalonians 4:6. So that was Roman numeral number 1, sex in marriage is pure and holy. Second principle, sex is not the basis of marriage. And marriage is not first and foremost a physical union. Marriage is not legalized sex. Now, here's where you have to start trying to think through in a lot broader ways. And we don't have time to really develop it all this morning. But I can remember growing up where you'd see a young couple with a baby, and mom or dad would say, yeah, they had to get married. Okay, so what did they mean by that? Well, they had sex before marriage, got pregnant, they had to get married. Is that true biblically? Sex is not the basis of marriage. Marriage is not first and foremost a physical union. Marriage is not legalized sex. Letter A, we just go to Jesus' statements in John chapter 4. John chapter 4 is Jesus and the woman at the well. And just picture, especially in that culture, but even today, I mean, if you see a guy alone with a woman out by themselves, you say, I wonder what's going on over there. I wonder what they're talking about. And you start asking questions in your mind. So here Jesus has sent his disciples into the city to buy food, and he's there alone with this woman. Well, Jesus in this conversation says in John 4:16, go call your husband and come here. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. So she has somebody right now. To use Facebook terms, I'm in a relationship. She's in a relationship with somebody who's not her husband. But she's had 5 husbands. So that kind of clarifies to me that just living with somebody, having sex with somebody, in Jesus' eyes is not marriage. Sex doesn't make a marriage, God does. This commitment that people make in a public way to each other make a marriage. So there's some way publicly that a man and a woman say to each other in a very public way, we are tying the knot with each other. And everybody around them understands, okay, they are married. Now, there are some that teach that until a marriage is consummated, that a couple is not considered married. We have friends that got married and the wife wasn't ever comfortable having sex, and within a few months went back to mom. Was that a marriage or not? Well, it was a marriage. They committed to each other before God and before the witnesses. This is not a normal marriage. They needed help. They needed help badly. But it was a marriage before God. Letter B. So Jesus said, look, just because you're living with somebody doesn't mean you're married. Letter B, although sex is not the basis of marriage, it's a very important part. God wants each married partner to participate wholeheartedly and passionately in sexual relations with their spouse. And I'm not going to take the time to get answers about this question, but just thinking about what would God say about somebody who says, I'm not going to passionately be involved with my spouse. And we could use words like disobedience and selfish or something like that. But we'll just hold off on answering that fully for now. Letter C. This is under sex is not the basis of marriage. Marriage is not legalized sex. Letter C. While sex is a very important part of the marriage relationship, it's not the most important. So what is the most important? Well, I think we have to go broader and say, God in Genesis 1 said it's not good for man to be alone. I'm going to make a helper suitable for him. And when we first started this year, we talked about gender differences a little bit. We talked about how Adam truly was incomplete without his counterpart, Eve, being together. To be a single throughout life is something that God has planned for some people, but it's not necessarily the norm for all people. The norm is to be married for this fulfillment of complementary companionship, where we're filling in where each other is weak. So God designed it in Genesis 2. It's not good for a man to be alone. I'm going to create somebody who's suitable to him. So key to a good sexual relationship would be the rest of marriage. Your spiritual lives together, your emotional lives together. If you are tearing each other up emotionally and constantly tearing each other down, I can guarantee your sex life isn't going to be that great. Mental unity, solving problems. There's nothing between you. So when you come together with sexual intimacy, it's because you have intimacy in other areas of life. And what a blessing it is for a marriage to have that. So again, marriage is not legalized sex. That is not the basis of marriage. However, it will grow out of this oneness of heart and life otherwise. Third main principle, Roman numeral number 3. The primary goal of the sexual relationship is giving and providing sexual satisfaction for your spouse. It's meeting the needs of your spouse. Letter A, the command is given by God in 1 Corinthians 7. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians 7. I want to read several verses here. The whole chapter is helpful relating to marriage and how we think about it, how you think about divorce, how you think about abandonment. There's a lot of information here. But the first few verses are helpful for the topic we're on right now. So 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me. So evidently the church at Corinth wrote to Paul asking him some questions. We don't have that letter, but we can kind of picture what it might be. He said, is it good not for a man to touch a woman? the different views about what that means. Is it good for a man to be single? It's good for a man not to be physically involved with a woman until marriage. We'll just move on to say, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, to avoid sexual immorality, verse 2, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. So it's a two-way street. Husband, wife, wife, husband. Verse 3, let the husband render to the wife due benevolence, likewise also the wife to the husband. The wife has not power of her own body, but the husband. Likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud you not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. Now, again, our main point is the primary goal is giving and providing sexual satisfaction to your spouse. Verse 3 is the primary focus of that. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, or the New American Standard says, let the husband fulfill his duty to his wife, likewise also the wife to her husband. Other translations would say something like affection, give your affection to the wife to her the husband. The duty or benevolence, you're giving to your spouse. Some even go as far, some translations go as far as giving the sense of it's their right. They have the right over your body. Your spouse owns your body. Verse 4, the wife doesn't have power over her own body, but the husband. It's not her body anymore. It's not my body, my choice. It's her husband's body at this point. And then the same for the husband. Never forget Pastor Robert, Mr. Smiley bearded guy. Early on in our college trip experience, several of the Christian colleges still had the rule of no facial hair for men, for students. And so here Pastor Robert comes in. Depends on when he had remembered to shave last. Sometimes it'd be really bushy, sometimes it wouldn't be. And somebody asked him, so tell me about your beard. Is that a health thing? Oh no, that's a theological thing. I wear a beard because of my theology. Oh really? Well, explain that to me. Well, my wife likes it, so I wear a beard. And he points right to this verse 4. I do what pleases my wife. Interesting way to approach life, to say, I do this, I wear these clothes, I dress this way, I act this way, because I know it's going to please my spouse. And what a wonderful way to approach marriage is whatever we do, getting up in the morning, leaving our dirty clothes on the floor, coming in from the mud, and leaving the boots in the middle of the floor, tracking all over the place. No, I'm going to live to please my spouse. And sexually, that comes in here. So this command is given to both. A husband, you please your wife. Wife, you please your husband. You have the duty, or you have this good thing that you're expected to be doing to satisfy your spouse. Both are required to give. And this is a command that again, we sometimes set it up different ways in English than the way the Greek put it. But this is not just a suggestion. This is a command. The whole context, all the way back into chapter 6, verse 15, don't you know that your bodies are the members of Christ? Shall I take the members of Christ and make them the members of a harlot? God forbid. So he's talking about sex outside of marriage. And that your body belongs to God. And as you're using your body for God's purposes, we come to verse 19 of chapter 6. Don't you know that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost that's in you? We often quote that, really not understanding. This is in a sexual context. our bodies belong to the Lord. So we need to control our bodies. How do we do that? Get married if you need to, in chapter 7. And so this is all one context. There were no chapter and verses as Paul was writing this letter. So letter A, this command is given by God that you do what pleases your spouse. It's not the other way around. Letter B, this principle is also taught by the definition of love. What does love mean? And I'll just give some verses here to illustrate. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Definition of love in John 3:16 is God gave. God loved, he gave. Another verse that would speak to this, Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives. How do I love my wife? What does that look like? Ephesians 5:25, just like Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. So what does love look like? You give yourself for your spouse. He gave fully, he gave completely, he gave without hesitation, he gave without reluctance. Some marriage books, and I'll say many marriage books, teach something like giving in order to get. If you just give to your spouse, they'll give back. Well, not necessarily. I think each one of us can attest to that. Not necessarily. We can give and give and give and never get anything back. That does happen. But we give anyway because we love. Yeah.
What's the book? I don't remember. We have it. Love. And that's almost
love and respect.
Yeah, I almost feel like that's, if you respect your husband, you will love. I mean, there's lots of helpful ideas in there, but sometimes we get the idea that that's what
Right. Sometimes we see it merely as a business relationship. That I will pay you such and such by rubbing your feet or whatever you want me to do in order to, and that's not what love is. Love is giving, period. It's not a business transaction. So that's letter B. Letter C, based on this definition of love, that love is giving, why would a person's involvement in the following areas be wrong and displeasing to God? So we think of pornography. Pornography is a fraud. That lady on that picture doesn't want you for anything. She's not interested in you. And in fact, you are not even interested in giving to her. This is a fraud. This is selfish. This is juvenile, you might say. It's living your life just wanting some more pleasure. It's just getting what you want. Masturbation, very similar things. Masturbation, there's often these fantasies that are going on in your mind. They're controlling your thoughts about the way you are going to treat somebody else. And you're using somebody else just as a toy or a tool. It's very selfish. And then when you practice this, it actually leads into your marriage in ways that you are not giving to your spouse, you are just using your spouse. Homosexuality is going even further. You are actually asking somebody else to do something that God has commanded them not to. You are going against God's design. God designed the bodies to function in a certain way, and you're going against God's design, and you're asking somebody else to use their body in a way it was not designed to be used. Science, what a joke. What a joke science is. Science has been used as an excuse to do all sorts of perverted things against the way God designed us. Science has been wrong in so many ways, and even, again, not to try to get politically into COVID or distract us, but we're finding that many of the practices about COVID were not helpful at all. When at the time they would say science says, or science has proven, and then, I guess science hadn't proven that. Well, when you start listening to science over God and the way God has said he's designed us to function, we're on shaky territory. So we could go on into other areas that would be displeasing to God because of sex being giving, love being giving. Letter D. In the past, some have wrongfully taught that achieving simultaneous climax is the standard for a successful sexual relationship. If we can just climax at the same time, we'll have succeeded. And you say, okay, well, your goal is to satisfy your spouse. Your goal is to give to your spouse, period. Sometimes your spouse just loves to snuggle. For us, sometimes just snuggle on the couch. Betsy is happy as a clam, she's fine. We were close, we were intimate. Everything was sorted out between us. There were no conflicts at the moment. We're close, we're together. And she's happy as can be. And I have to say, we were successful just then. We were successful. We were close. Letter E. What should our response be to anything outside the boundaries of marriage that stimulates the sexual desire? So this could be anything from outside the boundaries of marriage, having an emotional closeness with somebody of the opposite sex, or even somebody of the same sex, where you're doing marriage stuff, thinking about each other in ways that gets your sexual desire going. Well, we had hinted earlier with 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 6. Let's read the broader passage, 1 Thessalonians 4, starting in verse 3. This is the will of God, even your sanctification. God's will is for you to be holy. Sanctification is holiness. That is, now Paul's going to explain specifically what he's talking about in 1 Thessalonians 4. Specifically, that you abstain from sexual immorality. Stay away from fornication. There's not very many places in the Bible where you can say, this is God's will, and then it states it. Often it'll just say, it'll be a command, which a command is God's will, but here it says, this is God's will. Stay away from sexual immorality. Then it explains further that each of you may know how to possess his own vessel in holiness and honor, sanctification and honor, not in lustful passion. Control yourself. Anybody ever told you that? Not in lustful passion like the Gentiles who do not know God. You know God. You can live a different way. And that no man transgress, don't cross the line and defraud his brother in the matter, because the Lord is the avenger in all these things. Just as we also told you before and solemnly warned you, God has not called us for the purpose of impurity, but to sanctification. God hasn't called us to be impure, he's called us to be holy. This is one of the passages that is great to teach our children, to teach our young people. Don't defraud somebody. Don't tease them sexually to the point where they are tempted. This is one of the reasons why we say, guys, be careful how you touch girls. In fact, it may be good just to keep your hands away. Just don't be putting your hands all over them. Careful about kissing before you're married. I've said this before. Rubbing noses brings little buggers. And you start getting intimate with each other with touch. It goes further. I've been married 36 years. I know something about that. And talking to teenagers, talking to young people, I say, I've gone to bed with a beautiful woman almost twice as long as you have been alive. I know something about what touch does. something about what sweet nothings in the ear accomplish. There are things that we can do outside of marriage that may defraud somebody. What is fraud? Promising something that we can't legally deliver. And we don't want to do that outside of marriage. So just be careful about how we function outside of marriage. What impact should these truths have on our parenting? This is a totally other topic that could be taught in a different way. How to teach sexual principles to your kids. You are, by the way. You are constantly teaching by everything you do. But teach them that their bodies don't exist for their own pleasure. Teach them that early. No, your body is not for your pleasure, it's for God's. And then for your spouses in the future. That organ that you use, it has a special purpose to be used after you're married, only when you're married. And your motive is to please God by pleasing your spouse. Show them affection for each other as a married couple. Show them satisfaction with each other as a married couple. Words, actions. Sometimes we show discontentment. We show that we're just frustrated with our spouse. What does that teach our children about what our bodies are to be used for? If it's always, stop that! So say the wife wants to come and be snuggly and smoochy. In our case, that's usually how it goes. Betsy is the snuggly smoochy one. I say, get away from me. Leave me alone. I'm studying. Can't you see? I'm doing spiritual work here. And what does that teach our kids? We are teaching our kids by the way we respond to each other. Discreet, yes. Not necessarily prudish. But explain to our kids that satisfaction comes from being a loving servant, not by just getting pleasure for ourselves. So that's what you can do with our parenting. And then letter F, some problems you may have to work at resolving. Society tells us that sexual excitement comes from anticipating what you're going to receive, and you get excited because I'm going to receive something. The Bible teaches that we get fulfillment by giving, not by receiving. It's more blessed to give than to receive. That's given in the sense of 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, giving financially, but the principle then carries over. I'll just mention these briefly. Some would say it's not my nature. Sinful nature, what is your sinful nature? It's to be selfish. So you'd say, well, that's absolutely right, but what will God help you to do? God will help you to be giving. God's word is your guide, not what you feel like doing. It's not my nature to go to work. I don't feel like going to work. It doesn't give me pleasure to go to work. Well, do what God asks. Do what God expects. Another thing sometimes people say, I don't know what pleases my mate. Well, there's easy ways to find out. Ask humbly. Well, you said the opposite of that last week. Well, give them an opportunity to change their mind. Sometimes this week isn't last week. So ask. Pay attention. Pay attention to what gives them pleasure and what doesn't. Communicate with each other. Solve problems. Eliminate this conflict by sorting it out, like we talked about the last few weeks. Here's one that is fairly common. I only experience my spouse's affection when they want sex. This I've heard a bunch of times, and most likely I've practiced this a few times. Often the husbands are guilty as charged, where that's the only time we actually pay attention to our wives. Tender affection throughout the day, constantly. That's what your marriage is about, loving your spouse. Often if our wives are not responding, often there's some kind of conflict going on that probably ought to be sorted out. Gentle words, gentle actions. We love you. We're giving to you. We're not just trying to get something from you. So those are the first three principles. We'll deal with the next three next week.